mentioned the NHS there. Now, your government asked Lord Darzai, a very eminent surgeon, to look quickly into what was really going on in the NHS. The report's coming out this Thursday, but can you share any of what he has found already?
Yes, I can. I mean, I asked him, he's an eminent surgeon, I asked him to do a raw and honest assessment of the NHS, a diagnosis, if you like. He's been really clear that the NHS is broken but not beaten. And the reason he identifies, I'll rattle through them without spending much time on them, is because of the money that was taken out of the NHS, particularly in the early years of the coalition 2010.
Are you saying austerity is bad?
I mean, this is what he said during the election campaign.
But okay, so maybe stop doing it then.
It is funny.
You're doing the austerity. That last bit they were talking about, that was you doing austerity and defending doing austerity.
Because it's not wrong. This is explicitly what I've been saying. It's what we were saying. It's what Jeremy Corbyn was saying. Again, the amount of money going into the NHS dropped as a percentage of GDP every single year from 2010 to 2019, right? It was only Boris Johnson that increased funding for the NHS by that metric during the 14 years of Conservative governance. And this was when the waiting list started going up. People keep saying, oh, well, it's the pandemic that did deal with the NHS, and obviously the Tories can be trusted with it, but they can't deal with the pandemic. No, waiting lists were already much higher than they should have been. Every single year when waiting lists increase, fun enough, just as money was going down. What's that? Reducing the funding for a department. It means a reduction in service provision. I don't believe you, Helena. I can't believe it. And he's right to point it out, and it's clear that was what was being taken from this document that he's been given. And then what is Rachel Reeves's first action, apparently, according to Times leaks of her preparations? It's slashing budgets to the NHS. They're going to give pay rises to junior doctors, and it's coming out of the existing NHS budget with no ability to be able to have extra funding to cover what they're going to have to use for it. So they're going to have to cut funding for the actual provision of the service to deal with the pay increases that Labour have put on them.
Yeah, so he's saying removing money from the NHS, bad. But that's what we're going to do.
But they've been forced to do it, which again was the identical argument that David Cameron used in 2010.
Yeah, no, it's continuity Cameronism. That's exactly what this government is. The same excuse to perform the same policy. Make the crimes of the rich be paid for by the poorest and least able to fight back in.
Yeah, this is what's so tilting about the Labour Party and government as well, is that actually, apart from Clement Attlee, because even Harold Wilson did this, is that they were so desperate to be seen as economically credible, they just accepted not only Treasury orthodoxy, but accepted their opponent's framing of everything. Like, Wilson did this less, but Blair and Starmer have done the identical thing of saying, well, to look credible, we have to do the same song and dance that David Cameron did, and so we can't actually change anything. So I think David Cameron was deliberately lying about the state of NHS being something that they had to do. They knew it was a political choice. Yeah. A lot of people on the Labour right just kind of either are like Cameronites, or they've conned themselves into thinking there is literally no other way of being able to do this, so we have to reform it, right? There are plenty of people, I think, who are on the front bench who don't want to do what Wes Streeting's planned to do. He's a nefarious piece of shit, I guarantee, given the Alan Milburn stuff that's coming out today, that he essentially gave Alan Milburn access to a bunch of the stuff for the NHS, even though he's not been appointed to any position as an advisor, which is, of course, ghoulish because Milburn is one of the chief architects of NHS privatisation.
Indeed.
But there are plenty of NHS supporters on the Labour front bench or on the different parts of undersecretaries for the cabinet or whatever who think that this is bad, but think, oh, well, our hands are tied because we can't be in government to get the change we want unless we accept that framing, which means the Labour Party is doomed to be a vehicle against change rather than for it. Because they have deliberately, in service of short-term political gain, made the Overton window as right-wing as possible.
Yeah, exactly. Absolutely. I think that is the thing. I don't think most of them are Cameronites, for want of a better phrase, or Gideonites, whatever. I think it's partly they get sucked in by the bubble, and partly they're not really from the real world, and so they don't necessarily understand the problems completely. And they don't understand that anything other than just pleasing the right-wing media is like a strategy you can use in government. And so they're essentially forced through a lack of imagination, in essence, a lack of political spine, to continue the same thing because they think that's the only way government can be done. You saw, I think I pointed this out the other day, which I think you were on that stream, where he said something stupid, and it was the way he worded it showed that. Oh no, it was Rachel Reeves that showed that they fundamentally don't see the government as a vehicle by which change can be achieved. They're not fundamentally people who believe in or have accepted, like you say, the orthodoxy, the economic orthodoxy, that essentially the government isn't really there to make people's lives better. It's there just to allow businesses to continue to make money and nothing else.
Yeah, exactly. You're absolutely right in that regard.
Onwards, the Lansley reforms, which were hopelessly misconceived, took a lot of money and had to be then reversed. And then, of course, COVID on top of all that, which has put us in this awful position for the NHS. His diagnosis...
And actually, the COVID thing, it was so galling that they used it as an excuse as well, because the huge number of people who died needn't have, not just because of bad decisions made at the time, like, putting old people back into care homes that they knew were going to be exposed, which killed lots of their own voter base off, if nothing else. Amazing. But the NHS being consistently underfunded for the decade leading up to the pandemic breaking out meant that the NHS was absolutely at the worst possible point it could have been for that pandemic to hit it. You'd made it so frail and weak at that point that they're hitting it, and they had to build those Nightingale hospitals everywhere, because actual hospitals had no capacity to deal with any kind of increase in the number of people they had to deal with. It was embarrassing.
Like a developing economy, right? That's what we've been described as by a lot of people. And it's also really galling. Obviously, I mentioned before, like the plans for these cuts necessarily in operating budgets for the NHS coming in the first budget that's in October. But even before the first budget, Rachel Reeves cut a bunch of the hospital capital investment programs that had been promised by Boris Johnson that were going to be costing more than had been planned, which is why there was some expansion in the amount that was projected to be spent. And why the black hole came from was that capital investment projects, they'd underestimated how much these projects were going to cost. And he's just said that we had these problems with lack of investment in the NHS. You just said there, having to get these Nightingale hospitals was a problem of lack of capacity, lack of inventory within the NHS facilities across the country. And was the very first thing that Rachel Reeves did as soon as getting hold of the books and seeing the black hole was cut capital investment projects to expand the NHS inventory. This is insane. That was the first thing that she did.
Well, thankfully, we will never have another pandemic and it will never be a problem. Case closed.
My conclusion is the only way out of this now is reform. I think only a Labour government can reform the NHS.
By reform, he means privatisation, by the way.
He's absolutely not wrong that only the Labour government can reform the NHS. And it does mean privatisation, that's true. There was a really interesting interview on Times Radio that we listened to, I think it was a couple of years back now. It was quite an old segment that we did. Listening to Sajid Javid be interviewed about this. Because obviously Sajid Javid is a Randian, he's an objectivist. The conversation that he was having on Times Radio was that, everybody secretly admits that the NHS model doesn't work. Behind the scenes in government, because we all know from what George Osborne was talking about, how there was horse trading behind the scenes in 2010, about how they wanted to put up tuition fees. The Labour government did, but they thought they couldn't do it because they were Labour. And it's true, they wouldn't have been able to get away with it, but the Tories could. So there was horse trading in the background to try and get the Tories to do it in lieu of Labour, because they both agreed it had to happen, even though it didn't have to happen. So Sajid Javid was saying, well, we also believe the same thing is true about getting rid of the beverage model. We need to get rid of it, and everybody agrees, but the Tories can't do it because we seem to be the government that would always be bad about the NHS. So we can't do it. But the Labour government can definitely get away with it because they're seen as the progenitors of the NHS, which is basically true. So yeah, Keir's not wrong. Only the Labour Party can reform the NHS. And by reform, we mean privatise. We all know who Wes Streeting is being paid by. We all know who he's drafting in to help him privatise it. It's clear what their plan is. He says, it's always going to be free at the point of use and paid for by general taxation. But is it going to be owned by us, or is it just going to be subcontracted out to a bunch of different private tendered competitors? Who knows?
Indeed.
And therefore, we will use his diagnosis as the platform for the reform that we now need to carry out in relation to the NHS. I promised we'd get the NHS on its feet again, but I also promised I'd make it fit for the future. And this is the diagnosis, if you like, the platform that allows us to properly understand the state of the NHS and why it's in that place. But also, when it comes to technology, when it comes to empowering GPs and preventative measures, to look at how we're now going to reform the NHS so that we can not just look proudly as Labour Party always looks back proudly and says we created the NHS and 75 plus years ago. We've had a fantastic NHS in many respects. What I want to ensure people look back again and say we've still got a fantastic NHS because of the work the 2024 Labour government did.
But again, isn't part of this actually quite a clear political strategy? It's saying, look how terrible things are. Look at our inheritance. Aren't you managing people's expectation? And if it's all this doom and gloom, how can you expect people to feel inspired or hopeful about what you might be able to achieve?
Well, two things there. Firstly, yes, we've got Lord Darcy's analysis. I don't think anybody watching this is going to be surprised by his conclusion. I don't think they're going to say, well, when I went to A&E, it was perfect. I was in and out in record time. Everybody watching this who has used the NHS or relatives have know that it's broken. They know that it's broken. That is unforgivable, the state of our NHS. Now, I don't think anybody could say that's sort of just claiming or performative inheritance. There's one thing this country knows, it's the last government broke the NHS. Our job now, through Lord Darcy, is properly understand how that came about and bring about the reforms, starting with the first steps, the 40,000 extra appointments. But we've got to do the hard yards of reform as well. And as I say, I think it's only a Labour government that can do the reform that our NHS needs, and we'll start on that journey.
It's super frustrating because, again, these completely correct. And it's a good political strategy as well to hammer on what was clearly people's biggest concern going into the election. Outside of cost of living, NHS topped everybody's concerns, regardless of which party, and it really did cost the Tories loads of votes. So hammering on this thing when it's true, everybody who has interacted with the NHS knows that it's shit. They know that it's been absolutely catastrophically destroyed by Conservative Party failure. And of course, interestingly enough, is that they actually are kind of admitting now that it wasn't Rishi Sunak and Liz Truss that broke it. It wasn't a problem of Boris Johnson, the floppy hair Brexit bad man. It was the nice guy. It was the guy in the suit. It was the grown-up in the room, David Cameron and George Osborne, who broke it. But unless they properly change the paradigm that George Osborne and David Cameron set up, it's all just empty. And it's sad. It's really sad, because this could be a watershed moment for reworking the British public's relationship with government, and they're just throwing it away and incinerating it in a massive private equity funded neoliberal guff.
Perfect description. Yes, exactly. The neoliberals have bought the political establishment. They own it. They own Britain.
Hey there, if you enjoyed the video, make sure that you like and leave a comment. That helps the video out in the algorithm. If you subscribe and ring the bell, it'll let you know when I go live. I stream every day on YouTube and Twitch. You can also follow all of my socials down in the description. And if you want to support me in a more financial manner, there's a join button for memberships. It's just 99p to be a member on YouTube, as well as a Patreon, and there's some merch there as well. And hopefully I'll catch you on the next video. Take care.